of the leases session, we got approval of the ED75 yesterday. So we're now looking at the companion document, the request for information on public sector issues. And I think over to you, João, at that point.
Thanks, Ian, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, wherever you are in the globe. So, as Ian and Ross said, we'll start then with the RFI, the first agenda item, which is agenda item 6.2.5 on the RFI. Does everyone see my slides? Yeah, all right, thank you. Similar to what it was done with the exposure draft, staff and the task force took an ebb at developing the RFI, taking into consideration instructions from the September meeting. So I'm not going to big detail on what those changes are. They are in the issues paper that are taken as read. They are also in the slide if need be to pull over during the discussion. But I just want to highlight the three main new items that we are bringing to for board's consideration, which is in paragraph D, which is contracts containing lease type clauses, social housing, rental contracts, and shared premises with or without lease contracts. These three items are new that the board will see is seeing now for the first time, and with that I'll ask the board if it disagrees with the recommendation for the amendments that it was done to the RFI. Thank you.
Thanks, João. So just for clarification, what we will do though is just walk through the document, but everybody okay with those additional sections that have been included?
Yes, Ian. I'm ready to share the document, just like I did yesterday. If needed.
Honest, actually, João, based on yesterday, I think it's easier actually if we just do a conventional page on it. I didn't find it worked particularly well sharing the screen document.
Okay.
So I think we'll just do the page turn. Are there any points anybody wants to make before we just walk through the document? It's relatively short, so I think we can take that approach.
Just for members' information, the RFI starts on page 159, if you want to turn to the document.
Yeah, thanks, Ross.
Of the PDF.
Yeah. So in terms of taking us through this, the first page, which is really page 2, page 160, is essentially material we've seen before. Patricia, you want to come in?
Yes, thank you. My comment is more general. I think it's before the page by page. When I analyzed the raw document, I think that one point that we went to know if some arrangements are or not leases. Because this, I think it's important to present in more general. Then my suggestion are change the objective. I think it's more general. I think after that I can say about the text, but it's about the content, because this I asked him the word. And in the place of other arrangements similar to leases, I would use other arrangement that requirements about leases may be applied. because some kinds, for example, social housing, I think depends on the context that the kind of service is provided. It's can part of the service provided for the public, for the citizens, and then I think it's not necessary is a kind of lease. Because this, I think, I think it's better to put in the objective the question. It's a other arrangement that requirements about license may be applied. Depends on the description of the arrangement. I think we can conclude that it's a kind of service provides or a kind of revenue. I don't know. I think it's better to not determine before the requirements that the kind of situation is a kind of the leases. It's my point.
I think on this, I'm not going to take a debate. I don't think we're in a different place, Patricia. But I think we just need to be really careful that what we're trying to do is actually ask for general information at the moment. I think people will respond to this or not. I think we need to be careful not to overthink this. And I think, we've tried to keep the wording open, not tie it too directly to leases, but actually to give that sense. And I think at this stage, I'm reluctant to start playing with the objectives because we have had a lot of debate about that. I think there may be some finessing around the questions, but I think at this stage, we've had the discussion several times, and I would rather that we actually just carried on and get the document out and get some input from people. We can take the decision as to whether we think they are actually leases or not, or we need something different at a later stage, but we're just trying to keep it very open at the moment. And that might be something where, there are some tweaks in the language which would help, but I think I'm really reluctant to reopen this objective at this stage.
Yes, but I think when the way that we asked, we can create expectation about the treatment, the kind of arrangement as a leases. My question is this point. When I name it type leases type, I can create the expectation that you address in the leases standards. My point is this.
Well, I don't think we are.
Sorry?
I mean, I don't think we are at the moment. I think we've worked quite hard to try and open it up. We need to get this sense that this is things around the leasing space, which is why we're doing it. But we don't want to prejudge. We're just asking for information at the moment. And I think, so I don't think we're trying, I don't think we're really disagreeing here, but what I'm saying is I really don't want to get into wordsmithing this at this stage. I think we need as a board to get the information in from our constituents. So unless there's a quick fix that somebody can provide in terms of wording, which will address Patricia's point, then I'm going to move us on because I think we just need to get this out. Ross, I know you were trying to come in.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think the objective at the moment is clear on why the IPSASB is asking for the information. So I wouldn't think we might need to change the word slightly when we edit, but I don't think the meaning will be lost on constituents. It's clear we're gathering the information to determine what other guidance might be needed in addition to the leases standard. So I personally think the objective is right for the RFI and why we're taking this approach, at least from a principled perspective.
Okay, so I think at this stage, I'd rather just leave it as is. This is not authoritative. This is just seeking information, and I think we need to, we need to treat it in that context. This, it's just asking for information. It's nothing more at this stage. Okay, so I'm going to move us on. So if I can pick up any comments on page 2. Okay, so we move on to page 3, which is through to paragraph 13. Yeah, Camira, Todd, and David.
Thanks, Chair. In paragraph 11, in question 1, specifically, for both numerals, I will suggest to replace the word each arrangement by of this type of arrangement, because when reading the question, people can think like, wow, now I need to describe each arrangement that we have, and they will be reluctant to do it. But if we just say it more, word it more general, like, okay, this type of arrangement, then it will be better, I think. So thanks.
Thanks, Camira. Todd, then David.
Thanks, Ian. And this might be a point that can be picked up sort of as part of drafting, but I struggled a little bit with the way that question 1 was actually set out. And I wondered, when we start talking about the lessees and the lessors in the lead-in to the parts of the question, I wonder whether that's actually better embedded in the second part of the question. So we're really wanting the accounting treatment currently applied by either lessees or lessors, and maybe it needs to drop down into that part of the question. As I say, it may be something that can be picked up through drafting, but I just struggled a little bit with that question to know how to answer it.
Okay, thanks. And I see other members have got that concern. David, and then Lucy.
Thank you. I mean, I would support Camira's comment. I think asking for a description of each arrangement is onerous. I think we need sort of an example or examples, but not everyone.
Thanks, David. Lucy.
Thanks, Chair. My comment is on paragraph 11, question 1. On question, the second question, describe the accounting treatment. I think we can also have a question whether if the constituents have concessionary leases, and then they don't have accounting treatment currently applied, or even there is no proposal yet. So maybe we can ask for their why they are not why these leases are not accounted for in the books of accounts, because the assumption is, on the second question that described accounting treatment, that the presumption is that there is already an accounting treatment. But there could be situations where these concessionary leases are not even accounted for in the books of accounts. So maybe we can add additional question on that. Thank you.
Thanks. So summarising that, I mean, I think, Lucy, back on your point, it does say including if and how the accounting. So there is some conditionality in that, but I think what we're saying here is there is a general point, that both David and Camira have made, that we're trying to, there's an implication in the question about, each and every arrangement. It needs to be types of arrangements. I think there's a question, about whether we actually need the reference to lessees and lessors at all. And we can maybe word it a bit more generally. And I think we could be clearer to address Lucy's point about what we're doing is trying to ask for information, and if they are accounted for, how do you do it? That's really what we're asking for. So I think, the instruction on this one is that we need to get this question better phrased, and I suspect that the same points are going to come up through the other points. So I think in terms of working through this, what we're asking the task force to do, working with staff, is to come up with some changes in the formulation which actually address the points that have been made. So I think we take it as read that that will happen throughout the questions. Mike, back to you as chairman of the task force.
Yeah, a couple of things. So I suppose the task force, when it went through these, was trying to phrase the questions in such a way that we didn't get too much information, but we did get enough information. Does that make sense? So we were worried that you'd end up with getting a whole bunch of information that wasn't useful. And that's why we sort of try to phrase it the way that we did. And we thought it was important to get information from both the lessee and lessor's perspective. So I'm trying to think through why you wouldn't want that information. And I don't think we can have a task force meeting to resolve this. I think we need to resolve this week. So there isn't going to be time, I don't think, for a task force meeting. Maybe it's a case of Zhao and me and Lynn need to sit down and work it through. But we did try and explore these things that you're now talking about when we met. Okay, well, I don't really mind the mechanism, but I think I don't want to wordsmith this in the board meeting. I think we need to make sure we get information. I wouldn't worry at this stage about getting too much information. I think what we need is information to work with. So I think, look, as far as this question is concerned, my suggestion would be that basically, you know, I think you, me, and Ross can work with Zhao, and we will get the question framed right to address the people's points, if everyone's okay with that, because I think we're not far off. This is just a question about, we just want people to tell us about what's going on in their jurisdiction. That's right. Yeah. That we can work with it. So I think we just don't need to overthink this. I think we just need to get it out. So if everybody's happy with that, that's the process I would propose. And I would say we will take any additional questions as we go through the questions, but we will go through, that group will go through that process and we'll just crisp these up. Okay? Yep. Fine, okay. So let's move on then to page 4. Any comments on that? So then we move on to page 5, and here we're on to arrangements allowing right of use through social housing rental contracts and shared premises. And we move on to page, sorry, I've got David and then Camira on page 5.
No, sorry, page 4.
Okay, go ahead.
No, sorry, it is page 5. It's question 4. Sorry, do we need question 4? We haven't asked that question about anything else.
It seems premature to me at the moment because I think it's predicating the answer. So I think probably we should delete that. We wanted to keep this as open as possible. So everyone okay if we delete that? So then I've got Camira and then Patricia.
Thanks, Chair. In paragraph 19, the example that we are providing, I was just wondering if we can complement it with also mentioning the situation of contracts of services that include the right of use of an asset. So like the cell phones or things like that, because that is something very common, and maybe could also exemplify what do we mean by arrangement allowing the right of use. So that was only a suggestion. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Camira. I'll take comments and then go back to staff. So Patricia and then Mike. Oh, okay. So Mike, do you want to respond to Camira's point and then pick yours up?
So I'd like Camira to repeat her question, but I thought I would just go to question 4 quickly, because and maybe get a response from Todd or even Anthony, because that was put in there because this access right thing came up through New Zealand, and I just want to make sure we're right to take it out, Todd. I'm not sure if you've got a view or not. maybe think about it, and perhaps while.
But I think the point we're trying to make on all of this is we should not predicate the answer as to whether or what guidance we provide. And I think question 4, as David points out, is actually going ahead of that. At the moment, all we're trying to do is ask for evidence on this. The board can then make a decision based on what it gets in afterwards. So I think that's the reason why I think it should go at the moment, because it's actually taking us down a route. We're not asking that for anything else.
Okay, so as long as we get question 3 in there, we probably don't need question 4. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So
I'm happy with that.
okay, thank you. So then, sorry, Camilla, would you mind repeating your point about paragraph 19?
Sure, no problem. I was just suggesting if we can also include another example in paragraph 19, referring to those contract of services that include also the right of use of an asset. So that is the case of contract of services for, I don't know, cell phones, the telephony, the phone service that includes also the right of using very fancy and luxury cell phones that might be also above the threshold for recognition as an asset. So maybe not going into too much detail, but just mentioning, like, as an example, there are just contract of services that include the use of the right of use of an asset.
So before I answer that, Lynn, this was an item that you put in. So would that be the right? I hear what you're saying, Camilla, but I'm not sure that's the right place to put it. That's all.
So I've no objection to what Camilla is suggesting. I guess where I'm at. I think it would have to be a separate example so that we sort of whether we could put it as a separate sentence, perhaps.
Yeah, I think that's right. Okay. All right, thanks, Ian. Separate example. I'll work with Camilla or Joao to get that right.
I think, though, we just need to be very careful not to overexpand the scope.
I agree.
Because my worry about Camilla's example is it's it's pervasive across the economy, and what we're trying to do here is deal with public sector specific issues, and I think we have to be really, really careful not, and I think actually my suggestion would be, if you're okay, Camilla, is not to include the cell phone example, because otherwise we could get into conflict with ISB. And I think we just need to, not set expectations up that we're going to solve every problem, if that's okay.
So Ian, I support that, Camilla, subject to your thinking, but I think the question actually gives the option for people to raise that sort of example, because we do say, do you have similar types of transactions? So that somebody could say, well, the phone example is similar, and I'll respond in that way. So I think we've got the question covered.
Yeah, okay, good. Thanks, Mike. And I think that was Linda's point as well. So Leslie.
Yes, thanks, Chair. May I suggest that in paragraph 19, we delete the example on religious entities, because there could be a situation similar to ours where there is a principle of separation of the state and the church. So instead of using maybe religious entities, we can use non-governmental organizations or people's organizations. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy. I think we don't want to tie it down too much, so I don't see an objection to making that change. I see thumbs up to that, so we make that change. Thanks. Patricia.
Yes, the point I think in the 19, in my case, it's difficult to understand because the use of premise, I think premises that are another means that not relate with the assets. Maybe to change the word can facilitate for us, for example, in Portuguese language.
I mean, if we just used accommodation with that word.
Or properties, Ian.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Patricia. No, we want to make sure it's clear. So yeah, okay. Fine. So then we move on to page 6. Okay, so with that, we're through the text of the RFI. Now, what we do need to do at this stage is we need to go on and just talk about due process on this, because this is the first time we've cleared a request for information. Camira, you have a point you want to make before we get on to that? No, you're okay. Okay, good. So João, move us on to the process side of this.
Yes, thank you, Ian, and thank you everyone for the suggestions. I'll take them on board. Give me a second while I share my screen. Yes, so staff discussed the issue of the RFI. So once again, I'll take as read, but I think the most important message to consider for the board is that staff is of the view that the RFI fits in its essence in the IPSASB's due process, where we solicit views on matters under consideration. And the staff's recommendation is to follow the exactly same due process that it is used for the standard consultation documents, which is consultation papers and exposure drafts, having public exposure, responses posted on IPSASB's website, review of responses at IPSASB meetings. And so with this, I ask the board if it disagrees with the staff recommendation to treat the RFI in the same way as the other consultation documents. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. Everyone content with that proposal? Yeah, Camira.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, João. Well, this is related to something I wanted to point out in page 6, in paragraph 27, also in terms of the timing in which we will review the responses. So I do agree with the staff recommendation of following the transparent process of as it was a consultation paper or something else. But I think that we should not be very bounded in terms of saying like, okay, this is the essence of this paragraph of the due process, because then we will be also bounded to the timing of 120 days of exposure. And because we are not providing, so it's not we are not providing like a preliminary view or on something, we are just requesting information. So it doesn't even fits into the category of consultation paper or to a forum to obtain a specific information, because how I understand this due process paragraph when I read it is like those is in situations in which the IPSASB proposes some ideas and then we are trying to get information. But here in the RFI, we are just asking some questions, providing some examples and to get information. So in that case, I will not be so bounded in terms of the due process that establishes that for consultation papers, the usual period is of 120 days. And this also goes in line with what we have written in the paragraph 27, that we are saying that we will, the IPSASB will discuss the responses to this RFI after publishing a final standard on leases. And this is also not compatible to our work program, because we are stating in our work program that we will discuss this or review these responses already next year. But here we are saying that we will review them next year. So it will be after March 2022. And then people will say, well, why are you asking me for information now if you will review my responses in March 2022? So maybe we can play a bit with the times, maybe for EDs, so the ED 75 in leases provide 4 time period, but for the R5, I would suggest to shorten it a bit, maybe providing only 2 months or something, so that we receive the responses before, and then people can focus on the ED 75. So that will be the suggestion. So thanks.
Thanks, Camira. I think there's a number of points in what you said. I think there's the general process point, and Ross, if you can come back on that. I think certainly I agree with the loosening that you're suggesting, that we shouldn't tie it to after publishing a final standard on leases, because I think we've said all the way through this should inform our final deliberations, even although the two phases are separate, so they can run concurrently. So I think if we agree that we will loosen the wording on that, I must admit I would be reluctant to suggest a different comment period, just because I think people will be thinking about leases, and I think we agreed yesterday that we put the same questions into our ED 75. So I think they probably need to see the two together, which I agree. I don't think we should necessarily tie ourselves in process terms, but I think in this case, because they need to see the two together, probably it makes sense to have the same comment period. Ross, I'm going ahead of what you may say on that.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for the comment. On the due process point, I think it's important to say this is part of the information gathering phase, which the CP itself fits into. So there's a broad scope of activities the board can undertake. When we say in line with due process or follow due process for a CP, it's really related to how we'll treat the responses publicly and openly. There is a lot of flexibility on timelines. So the due process 4-month requirement you're referencing is the normal period in due process for an exposure draft. But in some cases, we do shorter as well as longer. So for improvements, for example, we do 30 days. When we did the COVID effective date delay, we did 30 days. So the board, it's in due process that we have the flexibility to change that when and as needed. So I think it's fine for the board to pick a period. And I just wanted to clarify, because at one point you made, Camara, made it sound like the speed with which we deal with the responses is related to that. The exposure period is just related to how long we give people to respond. It's then up to the board to determine when and how it wants to look at those. But when it does look at them, it needs to do so in a transparent manner. So the board does have the leeway to wait until after, but I do believe the work program and the plan is they'll start that work together with finalization of the ED, and there's nothing stopping the board from doing that. So, you know, we can clarify on that end, but I just wanted to be clear that there is some leeway there. This is part of information gathering, but it is best practice to be open and transparent in dealing with responses when you ask constituents to give you the input. That's why we've suggested that.
Thanks, Ross, for that. So I think we agree that we will clarify that drafting to make sure that those points that you've picked up there, Camara, are addressed, and that it doesn't preclude us from consideration earlier. But I think the proposal is, in this case, we stick with 4 months because it's then consistent with what we've agreed with the ED. Okay, so I think that's useful just to have had that discussion. So with that, so in terms of going through that, I think we've picked up a couple of subject twos. One is that point that we've just discussed on paragraph 27. We clearly need, with that small group, then to just revisit the exact phrasing of the questions to get the various points in that members have picked up. And there are 1 or 2 wording points, for example, the premises point, that we just need to substitute properties for that. So with that, I think we are ready to move into the approval process. So Ross, are you going to lead this, or is João going to do this?
The plan was for João to do it. I'll lead the vote.
Okay, João, back to you.
Thanks, Ian, and thanks everyone once again. With the final agenda item 6.2.7 of the issues paper, so we are now requesting for approval of the RFI, subject to what Ian has just said, that the staff will bring back that later in this meeting, together with the subject tools on the exposure draft. So with this, I ask the board if it disagrees with the staff and the RFI review group to approve the request for information for exposure, and of course the 4-month comment period that Ian has just alluded to. Thank you.
Okay, Ross, so move us through the voting process then, please.
Yes, so similar to the other votes, first I'm going to ask if you vote against the RFI to please raise your hand. And I'm not seeing any raised hands, so no votes against. Second, I'm going to ask if you want to abstain from voting to approve the RFI to please raise your hand. I'm seeing no abstentions. And then lastly, if you support the RFI approval, please remain silent. And everybody's remaining silent. So we have 15 members today, 1 absent, James Jung. So the RFI has been approved.
Right, so thanks everyone for that. So in terms of the comment period, staff have proposed 4 months as that's consistent with the ED. Does anybody disagree with that? Okay, good. So we do 4 months consistent with the ED. Todd? Todd, did you want to come in? Or are you having problems unmuting? Ah, good.
Ross, you noted that there were 15 and I think it's 17 members that have approved.
Sorry, you're right. Yes, 17. It's still pretty early here, Todd, but thank you.
The numbers thing. But you're right, Todd. Okay. So in terms of process, my proposal would be that we don't bring the amendments back for board approval. I think if everyone's okay, given this is not an authoritative document, it's just a request for information. What we will do is just that small group will meet and just sort out the questions to address the comments made by board members, and then anything else will be picked up through the normal editorial process, which we'll be going through on ED 75, so it'll go through at the same time on that. So it'll only be anything on ED 75 that we see coming back. Mike.
So, Chair, I just want, and I've got a conflict here because I'm part of the small group, but I support what you're saying. It would be really helpful, I think, for our constituents if we could get the RFI and ED 75 out ASAP, because there's going to be a bunch up of a whole bunch of other EDs. So let's try and get this one out.
I don't think anybody disagrees with you on that one, Mike. Ross? Yeah,
and we've been planning for this. So Joao's already been talking to our comms team, and the plan for us is early January to mid-January. We've got to work through the documents, but I don't think there's a significant amount of issues once we land the subject twos on ED 75 later in this meeting. We should be able to move fairly quickly and get this out in, early to mid-January.
Thanks, Ross. Okay, so Joe, I think that concludes the leases item then.
Okay, thank you, Ian, and thank you, everyone.
Yeah, and thanks once again to not only to Joao for moving it through, but also to the task force. I think you've really helped us get to this stage. Very efficiently and quickly. So thanks everyone for the time and effort on that. Okay, so with that, we move then on to natural resources. So in terms of the lead on this is over to you, Edwin, over to you.
Thanks, Ian. Let me share my screen quickly. Okay, so we have two agenda papers to talk about today. The first one is feedback from the CAG, and the second one is to go through chapter 2 of the draft consultation paper. So in terms of the first paper, you may remember from the September meeting that we were asked to develop an example timeline to talk about the sovereign power issue. So the staff has done that, and we have sent the example to the CAG for their feedback on whether the example is understandable and whether it's clear and easily digestible by constituents. So in terms of the issues that were discussed in the paper, so other than the timeline, we also added an example on incentive to sell off assets, and that arose mostly from constituents reaching out to us and asking if this is an issue, particularly during the COVID pandemic. And in terms of the feedback from the CAG, so most of the CAG members were supportive of the example and said it was very clear and understandable. But some members had feedback that could make it additionally better. And there were mainly in two areas. So the first area was some members felt that we should explicitly state in the example or talk about in the example the discussion of the underlying resources and how those are separate from sovereign powers. So right now, if you recall, the example is really just going through the timeline and the negotiation of the licenses. And it actually goes into entering into a binding arrangement and then issuing the license and goes into revenue recognition. So it didn't really talk about the underlying resources. And the suggestion was to add a brief discussion on how that is a separate, potentially recognizable asset, which is really the subject matter of the consultation paper. So the staff agreed with that suggestion, and we will be working that in the next turn of the example. The other suggestion on how to make the example better was right now there is a very quick, I would say, assumption in the beginning of the example that says we're assuming that the arrangement to issue the license is satisfied at a point in time. And that is because the example talks about revenue recognition a bit as well. And some of the members thought that it would be more helpful to just say, well, this example really focuses on asset recognition. So rather than having that assumption in there, it would be better to just say, you know, for a real arrangement, you would have to consider whether revenue is recognized at a point in time or over time, rather than just having a really simplified assumption like that. So again, the staff agreed with that, and we will be updating the example when we include into the CP. On the second issue on the incentive to sell off assets. So the issue arose because we got feedback from constituents saying that while during the COVID pandemic, a government might be incentivized to sell off assets, and particularly natural resource related assets, because right now there's currently nothing recognized in the financial statements. So in effect, any proceeds they get from these sales are almost treated like windfall gains. So we asked CAG members if they shared the same concern, and if they did, how we could address this concern in the consultation paper. And by and large, most of the CAG members noted that, you know, accounting can only go so far, and we can actually require disclosures, or depending on where we get to in the CP, there might actually be recognition of assets. And the recognition of assets and the disclosures would lead to information that can be used for better public financial management. But in terms of actually addressing this issue, the CAG members didn't think that accounting could solve this issue on its own. So because of that, we will talk about the issue briefly in the CP, but right now the staff does not plan to go have a lot of deep dive into this incentive, into this issue right now.
Thanks, Edwin.
Yeah.
I think at this stage I'd like to bring Thomas in. you know, in terms of anything additional to add in terms of observations.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. I had prepared this. Now it's a little bit difficult now to see what was already said and what I have on in my notes here. I think Edwin gave a very good high-level summary of what was discussed. I think again the timeline, the example was found to be clear and understandable. The timeline to be correct, but probably not complete. I think there was one kind of member saying that regarding the timeline, it seems to be of overarching importance for the discussion of kind of how to develop recognizable assets from sovereign rights. We discussed that this is equally applicable for the right to tax, and because of this overarching importance, the description of the timeline should potentially go into the conceptual framework even, and not be limited to the natural resources papers. I think, again, as Edwin said, in terms of completeness, there was an important point in the timeline which members felt was missing, and that was the identification of the natural resource itself. And addressing this point would be helpful to analyze the question whether and under what circumstances the natural resource itself could be recognized. One member said, what if, for example, if there is clear geological information about the volume of the subsoil resources, wouldn't that already lead to kind of a clear enough information for recognition of assets? But actually, their member said that there needs to be a clear delineation between valuing the underlying resource compared with valuing the licenses. And members recommended that there needs to be a detailed discussion of both concepts. Even if the board came to the conclusion that the underlying asset cannot be controlled or measured, the analysis should cover that and explain why. In that context, one member stated that regarding the starting point for recognizing assets and the corresponding revenue, he had the impression that the suggested approach would lead to an accounting close to cash-based accounting, waiting with recognizing revenue nearly until the point in time when the license fees are collected. And for his perspective, that was probably too late. Another member stated in that context that he would favor recognizing the underlying resources as an asset under specific circumstances, which are the volume of the resources clearly identified, there's an existing legal framework, there's an open and active market, there's clarity on the licensing procedure, and there's information available on the price. So under these 5 conditions, he thought it would be necessary to kind of recognize the underlying resource. And why that? The underlying idea of that was that there is an expense connected to issuing exploration licenses, which is the decrease in the remaining value of the underlying natural resource. And this expense can only be shown if the resources are on the books when the licenses are issued. So that was his point, where he said he would be in favor considering that there should be something or an earlier point of recognition. I think within the concept of valuing the licenses, members agreed with the conclusion that as long as no party has fulfilled their obligation resulting from the binding arrangement, nothing would be recognized in the accounts. It was, however, clarified that this does not need to be based on the guidance of ED 70, but it is already resulting from the general principles for executory contracts. So I think that was one remark which was made as well. I think Edwin already touched on the point regarding the revenue recognition. I think members were not sure why the example was kind of simplifying and saying, let's assume it's a revenue recognition is a point in time. There could also be a discussion whether the revenue recognition should be over time. And the suggestion was made to either extend the example or kind of leave it out completely and focus on the recognition of the asset rather than looking at revenue recognition and make it overly complex, distracting the focus point from recognition of the asset. Just one last remark regarding issue 1. One member referred to existing guidance of the SAC on proven and unproven reserves, which might help the board, and therefore recommended just have a look at that.
Thomas, can we stop at that point? And I just
Sure.
want to sort of give a pause for members' comments. I think one of the things, just before I open the floor for comments from members, I think one of the things that came through very strongly was we need to be very careful about positioning this, that the focus of this question is, have we got an asset to recognise or not? In developing guidance, we will need to be very careful not to cut across the finalisation of our standards on revenue. So anything that we do on revenue recognition would need to be clearly in the context of those standards and probably result in additional guidance in those standards, rather than trying to sort of have a parallel revenue recognition standard when we will already have those. So I think that we really need to be very careful about the fact that the real focus will be, have we got an asset, which of course is the first step in the flow chart in revenue recognition in ED71, and I think that was very much the substance of what you just finished up with. But I think we just need to be very careful that we keep that focus in mind. Okay, so I've got Rod and then Mike.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Thomas, for the comments. Always much appreciated from the CAG. At its most elemental level, what I feel I'm hearing from the CAG on a pretty regular basis is be careful as to how much of a problem you want to take on and bite off. In other words, be careful around what it is that you can fix and what it is that perhaps you're not intended to fix at this particular point in time. So where that takes me is two different places. And the first place it takes me is a kind of a general perspective that a standard isn't a destination, it's a journey. And I tend to look at the work that we're doing pretty much in 10-year chunks. In other words, when the people get around to reviewing the work that we've done 10 years ago, what problems are they going to fix? What problems do we want to fix now? What did people try to fix 20 years ago? And how do we want to focus in? So I think that goes to the whole point of being careful with delineating the particular problem that we're trying to fix now. I feel a lot of our discussions tend to focus in on that zone. And I think that it's important to think about that. My second point really has to do with capacity. And I think in a broader sense, one of the things that's really important to think about is the capacity of our stakeholders to do what we want them to do. So when we ask people to do that, I don't mean we as specifically, but when the profession asked people to do things 10 years ago, were they able to do it? When we're asking people to do things now, do they have the capacity to do it? And I'm thinking in particular of adopters who might have less capacity than some of the others around the table. So I think that's an important consideration. Do we want people to do it now, or do we want to do it 10 years from now? So I just think that broad historical perspective in the context of capacity, what people can do now, what we want them to do now, what we might want them to do later is an important kind of thought. And I feel that it's, in a general sense, important to have that in the back of our minds as we move forward. So given this is my last meeting, consider it a little bit of parting thinking.
Thanks, Rod, for reminding us about the bigger perspective. And I think, one thing that is clear with this project is it's something that people have been asking for us to do for a long while, because it is, given your points about, adoption and so on, actually, there are a lot of jurisdictions around the world where they are resource rich. They're also wanting to improve the standards of accountability and so on. So I think, reminding ourselves that this is something that people have been asking for a long while and are eager for it, but also mindful of your point about being focused on what is the problem we're trying to fix, I think is a very useful exhortation. And on your point on time reflections, I remember the first time that somebody really pinned me down on this one. I was in Kazakhstan in 2014, and they were going, "You really need a standard on this." So Probably by the time we get to the end, that's your 10-year time horizon. Mike.
Thanks, Chair. And maybe what I'm saying is a continuation of Rod's comments. Thanks, Rod. So, and Thomas, I listened to the discussion with a lot of interest, and there was an awful lot of points that were being made, but I kept going back and saying to myself, this exercise was around trying to develop when do we have sovereign power and when does sovereign power result in an asset or not an asset. And I thought that's what the timeline that Edwin and his team were trying to explain. So when the CAG started talking about proven and unproven reserves, and perhaps you need to recognize the underlying asset at an earlier stage, that said to me, oh, this project's getting bigger than I thought it might be. That's a lot of work. And the private sectors, when they get around to discussing gold reserves and, for example, proven and unproven, I'm not sure they've got a standard on that developed even now. So I think we just got to be cautious here. Let's not take on more than we can.
Thanks, Mike. I mean, I think a lot is how we do this, but it is really, I think, what came through for me, and I think there was, in some respects, that people were trying to widen this question way too much. It does come back to what is an asset in the context of sovereign powers. When can you recognise something? And I think we probably need to use that proven, unproven point in that context. Ross, happily, you and a number of members of the team actually have direct experience of this in Canada. So I think you'll be very helpful. That practical experience will help us a lot. Over to you, and then I'll go back to Thomas.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that in terms of the requirements around proven, probable reserves, resources, and whatnot, and the use of that in the private sector, it is used in the context of financial reporting, but mostly from an impairment calculation perspective as an input when you're doing cash flows. The requirements for reporting those are outside the financial statements, whether it's SEC requirements or local requirements in other jurisdictions where there's lots of mining. So when we're talking about that type of reporting, that's not in the financials unless it's driving a number in a calculation for impairment. And that comes through the cash flows driven by those and how you come up with your assumptions for cash flows and recoverability of the assets. And again, that's usually for testing what's called mineral properties, which are capitalized costs that entities have expended in developing their mining or oil and gas resources. It's not the reserves themselves. So there is a fine line, but the good thing is in that space and how to define that comes from the geological profession. It's well known in mining rich jurisdictions. There are regulators like the SEC, like the Canadian regulator, and there's a code called the JORC code that comes from Australia, where there's a common practice on those types of reserves, resources when they're disclosed for the purposes of accounting. But again, it is outside the financial statements. And we might get into this if we talk about IFRS 6 later in this session, but we can give you more of an overview on how that standard from the private sector works and the work on the ISB on that. But yeah, it is complex.
Okay, so before I go to Thomas and Adrienne, I think coming out of the discussion, then the instruction to staff will be, as I think you foreshadowed, Edwin, to work up the example further. And I think what came out of that discussion was that there probably are a couple of other points potentially that we need to be clear on what the principles are here. So we will need to see that further worked up example back again for the discussion in March. Okay, so I'll take final comment from Thomas and Adrienne, and then I want to move us on.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Just a short reaction, and I will be brief to what Mike just said. I think people were just seeing this triangle between kind of the natural resource itself, the sovereign power to the natural resource, and the licenses which were derived from the sovereign power. And they just wanted to have kind of an understanding of the whole complex. And again, I think it was said, it can be easily described in the paper that the natural resource 4 reasons which are given should not be recognized for that reason, but members just felt it is necessary to explain it and to make it transparent that the board has seen that, because this triangle is very visible, and especially countries which have oil or gas or whatever reserves are focusing on that underlying asset and ask the question what to do with that.
Thanks, Thomas. I think in terms of the CP, but also visuals that go with this, we need to set that context, the broader landscape, if you like, but also be clear about what the question is that we are trying to focus on. So I've got Adrienne and Lindy.
So on the broader landscape, I found the discussion on the CAG really interesting yesterday, and they covered ground that I had discussed bilaterally with Edwin and Ross on the treatment of proven and probable reserves. And Edwin gave me the same answer that Ross has given us today, that there isn't a private sector treatment, that this is outside the financial reporting. So I can understand that we don't make a standard where we lead the private sector, but I find it tremendously helpful to have this written somewhere. And I wonder if it can be, for example, in the basis for conclusions, just to put explicitly that these questions come up about the treatment, and since there is no standard, we're not going to have a standard, but nonetheless we're confronting the issue. I think that would fill a big gap, and I think the discussion in the CAG made it clear that everyone has the same sort of suite of unanswered questions, and we could answer them without putting them in a standard. Thank you.
Thanks, Adrienne. I think we need to be careful what we can do and what we can't do here. And again, I think this comes back to, we can communicate what the landscape is. We can't give guidance that goes broader. And I think we need to be very careful about expectations here. So that communication piece is going to be very important here. I think, people were raising much broader philosophical questions in the CAG, which we really can't, we can never answer. There are some things we can answer, there are some things we can input to, but I think we just, as we've recognised all the way through, we have to be really careful about what the scope of this project actually is. Lindy, back to you as Task Force Chair.
Thank you. So just on the bigger picture, and just to comment on that, and maybe we were our own victims in what we put forward to the CAG. So the CAG, we discussed just the sovereign right and the power, and that power isn't an asset. But in the CP, what we're exploring next is the underlying resource and the subsoil assets. So we will be looking separately at those resources that are still on the ground, and through that, the CP process, we're going to start looking at that just now and come to conclusions. And what we will then do is combine the two, and whether or not it's on the same time frame or it's a separate discussion, the idea is to put them together. We were just only ready to take to the CAG the sovereign power matter. And I guess they rightfully pointed out that, there's more to it. We just hadn't at that point in time, we weren't ready at that point in time to discuss that in further detail, but it's coming.
Thanks, Lindy. So Thomas, you wanted to give us the feedback then on the second part of the discussion?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. As Edwin introduced in the second topics, CAG members were asked whether they were of the view that some jurisdictions may be incentivized to sell off natural resources and related licenses because of the COVID-19 pandemic. As an immediate reaction, one member stated that this would be the wrong question. The real concern around selling natural resources should be how to avoid that governments show only the revenue part of it and not the connected expenses in terms of decreased resources, as explained earlier under issue 1. Several members confirmed that this is a concern closely connected with the aspect of intergenerational equity, which needs to be addressed. And they, however, stated that this was already an issue pre-COVID-19 times. This is not something which is limited to COVID-19 and the effects of it. Members in that context discussed whether the existence or non-existence of accounting guidance would have an impact on the incentive to sell off natural resources. And one member stated that psychologically, there might be a chance that on the basis of existing guidance, governments might want to recognize an asset resulting from a natural resource. But to deal with that, there is a need for more than only financial accounting, and Edwin alluded to that as well, as financial statements have a limit. What is needed from a CAG's perspective are instruments such as non-financial statements containing information like carbon emissions connected to natural resources, or the presentation of information on the long-term development of network. In that context, there was a call on the IPSASB to provide clarity on already existing guidance regarding cleanup costs and connected liabilities. And Ross kind of made that clear that there is no need to develop something further. It's already existing. There just needs to be more transparency where to find this aspect. In general, there was strong support for the opinion that there are limits to what accounting could do. If governments want to sell off assets, accounting cannot stop them from doing this. However, it was noted that disclosures on reserves and resources may provide useful information and create transparency. And lastly, it was further noted that it is important to address in the CP that accounting can inform better decisions on the use of resources from a PFM perspective, and that this is especially important during crises like the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is the context to the current situation. Thanks, Ian.
Thanks, Thomas. And I think, you know, that was a very interesting discussion because obviously COVID does provide a sharper focus and a greater incentive, but it's already a risk that, you know, jurisdictions will try and sell off reserves cheaply without being accountable for the loss in value. And that comes back to that recognition of the asset in the first place, which really provides a very powerful incentive. I think Ross certainly pointed out the fact that we have the staff Q&A, we also have guidance already. And I think, you know, we need to, again, this comes back to the communication piece. We need to sharpen up the focus on what we've already got, you know, in terms of RPGs on long-term financial sustainability, service performance, FSD&A, all are relevant in this space. As we've said already in the Q&A, and they do help people with reporting on SDGs and so on. So we just need to keep reminding people that communication keeps going about this is where this fits in the broader landscape. But it nevertheless, I think, was a rich discussion. Lynn.
Yeah, just linked to the point you were just making, and I don't know if we've already done this, so forgive me if we have, but I wonder if there's almost a sort of idiot's diagram that we could do that shows where this project fits in and where other things fit in, and then use that consistently across the various bits of literature so we can always then place where we are with this project.
Thanks, Lynn. I think that's sensible, and it may well sit alongside, for example, the diagram we've already got in RPG 1, which sets the balance sheet in context against where future economic flows come in and so on. So I think that's an excellent idea, and that's certainly got thumbs up from other members. I think the more we can do in that communication space, the better. Okay, so I think, you know, from that, we've got a lot of rich feedback from the broader perspectives that we've got within the CAG. Certainly, I think Edwin's sort of summarised the areas where we will definitely need to update that discussion of sovereign power and provide a more nuanced view in some cases. So we'll need to see that back again, I think, in the March meeting, and I think it was useful to get that reminder about PFM incentives and that discussion. So I think that worked well, and it's timely for us as a board. Edwin, anything else on that, or do we want to move on to looking at the new drafting in the CP?
I had no other issues on that first paper, so I can move on. Yeah.
Okay, so we move on then to the updated drafting on the CP.
Okay, so in terms of Chapter 2, which has been circulated to members, broadly speaking, the chapter is broken down into three broad categories. And we have actually, as a task force, come up with preliminary views for each of these areas. So the three areas that we talked about were the ability to demonstrate control on unextracted subsoil resources, whether these unextracted resources can be recognized as an asset. And also lastly, we had a view on the relevance of accounting for exploration, evaluation, development, and extraction activities. And that really ties into IFRS 6, as we'll see. So for this presentation, the way I think we should cover this is I'm going to talk about the PVs in detail in a bit, but I just want to remind members that if you have any editorial or any other comments, please email them to myself so I can work them into future drafts of the consultation paper. So in terms of the first PV, and I'll stop and so that the members can discuss after each one. The first PV that we've come up with as a task force was that in some circumstances, it is possible for a public sector entity to demonstrate control over unextracted subsoil resources. And before I jump into the debate, I just wanted to let members know that we did get some feedback before this meeting on the first PV, and the feedback was that some of the members thought that we need to flesh out how we're concluding that subsoil resources are a resource for financial reporting purposes. And admittedly, I kind of glossed over that in the CP because in the conceptual framework right now, there is a mention that mineral interests are a resource. So that's why there's only 2 paragraphs on that right now, but definitely we can flesh that out. There was also a comment that we need more on the assessment on control. And right now in the consultation paper, we've taken the feedback that we received from the survey that was issued in September. And based on that, we've come up with 4 categories of jurisdictions. And we said for one of the categories, it seems very clear that a government could demonstrate control. But what we didn't flesh out was that to demonstrate control, you still have to do some form of testing to at least show that there is something in the ground in terms of resources. And we still have to, the government still has to demonstrate that there is a plan in place to actually access these resources. So again, the staff completely agrees with this point, and we will be updating the CP to flesh out this analysis. Another point that we got was on the past events. So right now, one of the comments was, well, if let's just say a government has the right to get to the resources, but they need to expropriate land first in order to do so, then does that expropriation really count as the past event to give rise to control? And on closer reflection, I agree that yes, that would be the past event that drives conferring control of the subsoil resources to the government entity. So again, we will be updating the analysis of control to incorporate that point. So I'll stop there for PV1 in case there are any comments from members.
Okay, so thanks for that, Edwin. And I think that does bring out an important point that in terms of the analysis in the CP, it needs to be self-standing. So we should not take for granted if we are working with something in the conceptual framework, we've got, I think, go back to other examples like possibly heritage and 1 or 2 others like that, where we've used maybe social benefits as well, where we've used the conceptual framework and we've picked up the definition and we've then been absolutely clear how it is that this fits the context for the definition, because that will drive to then the PV, and the preliminary views will be really important in terms of the board giving an indication to stakeholders on their proposed future direction. So those PVs are really important in terms of our thinking as a board, and our proposals for the future direction, so that constituents can support or react against, generally comment, give us feedback. Okay, so I think with that clear instruction, we need to make the very clear links into the conceptual framework in the analysis. Take comments on the PV. Anything additional to the issues that Edwin has already identified? Okay, so I think you've identified the issues there well. So if you can bring us back an updated version then for March that reflects those comments.
Yep. Okay, so on to PV2. So the second preliminary view we had in the CP was that because of measurement uncertainty, the unextracted subsoil resources do not meet the asset recognition criteria. And that's because despite being able to demonstrate control in some circumstances, because you don't really know what's in the ground until it's extracted, there is really no way to come up with a reliable estimate. We had two comments from members on this. One of the members just said that they agree that PV, which is good. The other one pointed out that we should be careful and say that it's not recognized because the resources are not reliably measured. And that's important because later on in the CP, the plan is to talk about whether we should have disclosure requirements for unextracted subsoil resources. And these these disclosures are based on geological studies. So it is measurable in a way, but not reliably measurable enough to be recognized as an asset. So the staff will make sure that we have the wording right to be consistent across the board in the CP to always always refer to whether something is reliably measured.
Thanks, Edwin, and that certainly seems to go in the direction of that discussion earlier about proven and unproven. And I've got some flags up on this one, so I go to Camira and then to Scott.
Thanks, Chair. I disagree with the recommendation because I think there might be situations in which the underlying asset could be measured reliably, and this goes in line with our previous discussion of the feedback obtained from the CAG. When we said about proven reserve, yeah, I tried to search, inform myself a bit more about that, and it seems that it's quite, it has a good probability of certain, so it has some certainty, like 90% of certainty, that when you have a proven reserve, then so there is less uncertainty in this case, and maybe we should consider as a board to see the possibility of recognizing then the asset in such situations, in line to the feedback from the CAG, that maybe if the underlying asset fulfills a list of criteria, like having proven reserve and other things that reduce this uncertainty, then the asset should be recognized. And also this could go in line, I took a look also to the national accounting standards in Bolivia, because they have two. They have one for the oil industry and one from the mining industry, and the structure and how they have their standards is separated per phases, including even the phase of search. Like the first phase of search is when they are even looking for a potential place where they can be some subsoil resources. Then they go for the acquisition phase, where it's like when they really set up the acquisition rights to exploit the subsoil resources. And then then it goes in line with what we have already proposed here, the other phases of exploration, then development, and then in the accounting standard, what they do, what it describes in each of these phases, what are the accounting implications in terms of, okay, which costs you are allowed to capitalize, how you should depreciate these assets are, what you are constructing. And they also make reference, like saying, like, okay, when you are in the exploration phase, you are still, your reserve is only probable, but when you are in the development phase, your reserve is already proven. So maybe we can also make some linkages, like, okay, when there is a proven reserve exploration phase, and that is maybe an appropriate moment to recognize the underlying asset because there's less uncertainty. So thanks.
Thanks, Camira. I think some good challenges there. Linda, you want to come back on what Camira said? Yep. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. And it also struck me when I was listening to the CAG meeting yesterday. So I do think we probably have to bring that discussion in. And I think what we need to do, as Edwin said, is that we need to test that against reliably measure in our conceptual framework. So although potentially it's proven and there's a figure attached to it, does it meet the IPSAS standards for reliably measure? And I think that we need to bring in. And if it does, then obviously, but if not, then we would have the justification. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Lindy. So I think that further analysis would then be very helpful in terms of how categoric we can be in that PV. Scott and then Mike.
Yes, I think we're too easily to dismiss this as not measurable. And so I'm agreeing with Camira. I had sent Edwin the STC document on that. And whilst you are right that the reserves are used for impairment testing, but if those reserves measurements were not accurate, you wouldn't have a basis to do the impairment calculation on. And so I think it's too easy to say, well, it's not. The other thing is they're actually issuers of financial statements, which have restated their financial statements because of the reserve numbers. So to assume these numbers are not subject to some degree of rigor, I think would be erroneous in this conversation. And I think the way we set it up here will be important for the later measurement discussion that Edwin talked about. So we need to have a robust discussion here in this side, no matter what we decide to recognize or not, because I think it will set up a later discussion about disclosure. They're very much connected.
Thanks, Scott. Mike, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. And I agree with those comments. I think it's important that as we go through this, we clearly separate what the asset is. I mean, the asset of money spent on development or trying to work out what the reserves are is an intangible that you may want to capitalize under a different standard. Money spent on assets that you use to work all that out may be equipment that you would capitalize under PP&E. So I think we just got to be careful what asset are we talking about. If it's just the reserve, that's fine. Let's make sure that's what it is we're talking about. And then whatever we come up with, make sure it's capable of being audited.
Thanks, Mike. I mean, I think, listening to the discussion then, I think, as Lindy said, it does very much come back to what's reliable, and we need to get more into that because, of the challenges that Camira quite rightly put. And as you say, it's got to be something that can withstand audit. Equally, that point about what the asset actually is that we're talking about will come on to exploration costs and so on, following on from this. So that clear focus on what it is that we're trying to address here. Okay, anything else? Any other points from members on PV2? Okay, so move us on then to the next discussion, Edwin, please.
Okay. So the last PV we had was the accounting for exploration, evaluation, development, and extraction activities. And essentially, this is whether we should incorporate IFRS 6 into our literature. And the discussion was in the CP was limited to whether it's relevant to the public sector. And the reason why it's limited is because we originally were going to actually propose whether we should adopt the IFRS 6 or not in the CP itself. But the more the task force looked into it, it became a more complex issue because we noted that in the IASB's conceptual framework and in the basis of conclusions to IFRS 6, they weren't actually clear that any asset that is recognized under RS6 would stand up to their own conceptual framework. And essentially, a lot of the reasoning behind allowing constituents to recognize an asset was because the practices in the mining industry was so diverse, and they almost granted an exception to entice entities into adopting IFRS 6. So because of that, the task force felt that it would be more appropriate to bring this issue back in March in a separate issues paper where we would go through in detail, whether we could adopt some sort of similar standard and have it be consistent with the IPSASB's framework. So right now for the discussion in the CP, it is limited to just whether this issue is relevant to the public sector. And the PV is that it is relevant, sorry. So I'll open that up to members.
Thanks, Edwin. And I think that analysis that you're proposing will be very important, because I think we should have a view on that. And in the CP, I think it would be important that if we're thinking of bringing, including IFRS 6 as part of this project, that constituents understand that. So there's almost two parts to the question: are these types of costs relevant? And if so, do we bring in IFRS 6? Okay, Mike.
Thanks, Jess. I support the question. I just wondered what the answer might be. That's all. If the answer is yes, so what? Presumably you've got that, or you'll cover that in some sort of way in the text, because if the answer is yes, then we've explored why that's the answer we're looking for. I just wasn't sure the answer we're looking for.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I mean, I think that does come down to the tactics in terms of how we write and construct the CP. If you going back in time to the CP that we wrote for long-term financial sustainability, when we were doing that, essentially each of the chapters actually landed at a PV at the end of it, and that was what drove the analysis. So I think we'll end up playing around with this a little bit more before we get to finalisation. But the important thing is this is exposing the issues for us at the moment. David?
Thanks, Ian. I'm probably now going to repeat just something of what you've said, because it occurred to me when Mike asked the question and listening to what Edwin said, we probably need to wait on this one until we see what comes back in March. And then we can make a decision on what question we ask and how we ask it, because we've got more information.
Okay, so I think that's that's clear that we will look at that paper that staff bring back. Certainly is relevant in terms of Mike's challenge, and then we'll review at that stage. Edwin, Lindy, does that fits then with what you were looking for in terms of the discussion of PVs, sorry?
Yes, and I think Luzvi also has a question.
Yeah,
oh, sorry.
I saw Lucy's flag go up just as I started talking. But from the task force point of view, that gives you sufficient in terms of the PVs at the moment.
Yep.
Yeah. So at that point, I'll go to Lucy.
Yes. Thanks, Chair. I'm just supporting the comment of Mike. Maybe if the answer is yes, maybe we can ask for examples of agreements that are existing in the jurisdiction, and how do they account for this exploration, evaluation, development, and extraction activities. Um, I would just like to cite an example in our country where there are three modes of mineral agreements. First is mineral production sharing agreement. Then we have co-production agreement and joint venture agreement. For the co-production and joint venture agreements, the share of the public sector is negotiated with the contractors after considering factors like capital investment of the project or risk involved, contribution of the project to the economy, and other factors that will provide for a fair and equitable sharing between the parties. So for the agreements where the public sector contributes in the mining operations, the accounting for exploration, evaluation, development, and extraction activities is truly relevant to properly account any related utilization of public sector resources. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. And I think that probably does go to the how we use the CP to get as much contextual information as possible. I think, and Ross, perhaps you can correct me if I'm wrong, we have used a combination of preliminary views and specific matters for comment in consultation papers in the past in order to get information in from constituents that we can then use as we move the project forward.
Yeah, there's much more flexibility in a CP than an exposure draft, where the board can have a view and it can also have an open question. So we can use a mixture of the two. And I think we'll continually have to revisit the questions we want to ask by chapter as we move through the issues, as the board flags things it wants specific feedback on.
Thanks, Ross. Adrienne.
In reacting to what Lucy said, normally I'm the one who wants to go wide, but in this case, I think it would be wrong to start looking at the various types of contract out there, because they're all for the use of the asset rather than the recognition of the asset, and I think plus they're so massively developed. I mean, this is a case where the private sector has huge documentation, and there's a well-established literature. And I understand that what we're doing in this standard simply doesn't go there. We're just looking at the recognition of the asset, and we're not looking at contracts for use for exploitation or even exploration. So the costs may be relevant, but that's not the topic that we're dealing with in the work we're doing here. Thank you.
Thanks, Adrienne, and I see support for that. I mean, I think, again, it comes back into this, what's the landscape here and what other guidance do we already have? Because we've got guidance on joint ventures and things like that already. Certainly on the revenue side, we will, by the time we've completed this project, we will have completed the revenue projects. So it's possible that we can add additional examples and so on, if that helps. But again, the focus, as you say, Adrienne, is what's, an asset we can recognize. Ross.
Yeah, kind of building off what you're saying, Ian, I think it is important in the CP that we're clear about the guidance we already have that covers these wider arrangements. So we do have the full suite of consolidation, joint venture, joint arrangement standards that are aligned with IFRS in our suite. So that's not a gap in our literature, and I think we need to make sure we're clear on that. Same with any FI type arrangements like co-production agreements, things like that, net investments in assets, that's all covered mainly through the FI suite of things. So, the board, I think, made a smart decision at the beginning to look at the gap in our literature, and it is those resources. But we do need to describe around that a little bit better and more fulsome, the links with the other standards and those things that come in. For the purpose, if we don't, people will tell us we've missed it when we haven't. The guidance is there, it's there to be used. If governments are using IPSAS now and they have those agreements, they should already be accounting for them now. This should not be a gap.
Thanks, Ross, and I see a number of thumbs up on that. So I think that's been a good discussion on the PVs. Edwin, in terms of the draft material, do you want to go through that at the moment, or are you content to take comments from members? Session?
I was content with taking comments from members because at this stage, I think it's too early for page by page, unless you disagree, but I think it'll be a better use of board's time if I get comments separately.
Yeah, I mean, unless there's anything, you know, a burning issue that members want to bring up at this stage, my suggestion would be that, you know, as clearly members already have, that they give you comments offline, because we are going to see these back in these sections back in March, you know, firmly linked to the conceptual framework and with the PVs worked up and the further analysis that you've talked about. So anything else anybody wants to raise at this point in time? Yeah, Lindy, back to you.
Thank you. Just the only thing I wanted to say before we close off on this item is to thank board members and staff and TA for the responses to the survey. It was very useful, and you'll see in the chapter how it has been incorporated. So just to say thank you for that. Thanks.
Thanks, Lindy. Okay, so Edwin, anything else you need now?
Not from my end. No.
No. Okay. So I think that with that, we finished the section on natural resources. That does put us ahead. I think my proposal, Ross, subject to your views, is we might move to revenue for the rest of the morning, or do you want to do the? I think that probably is the most logical.
Yeah, I'm fine either way, whether it's revenue or the work program.
I'm kind of thinking it may make sense that we do revenue, because obviously we'll get a bit further then with the measurement, and we'll have the discussion about the comment period for the EDs tomorrow, and that may well help in terms of the discussion about the work program and how we move that forward. So I think we'll take a break now until 10:02, and then we'll come back, and then Edwin, if you and Eileen can be prepared to lead us into the session on revenue. Okay, so thanks everyone, good input so far, and see you back at 10:02.
1 minute.
Right, okay, so we move into the session on revenue. I think, not to steal staff's thunder, but I think one of the things that's been fantastic is the level of responses that we've had. I think, you know, this is very much a record, the almost 200 responses that we've had across the 3 exposure drafts, the 2 revenue ones and the transfer expenses ED. That's fantastic. Really good range of responses geographically and particularly from the international organisations. And I'd like to thank staff in particular. I think they've put a lot of work into outreach, and that has definitely resulted in I think a much richer range of responses for us to work with. So I really wanted to make sure that we, we acknowledge that effort that's gone into outreach. There's a lot to work with. We won't be able to go through everything today. And indeed, actually, one of the purposes of today is actually to get us to take a stand back. We did a lot of detailed work in the exposure drafts, but I think there are some bigger picture messages that clearly come through from the responses, which we need to take a bit of time to actually discuss and to just absorb some of the messages. And it's also a case that we've had there's a very good discussion in the CAG on Monday that's relevant as well to our discussions. And I think particularly it's good that we use that rich input from the CAG to focus on the bigger picture before we start to dive down into the detail. And there will be plenty of time in March for that. So just to put that perspective on this. And I think with that, I'll probably pass over to, is it Eileen going to kick off or is it Edwin? I'm not sure.
Me.
Okay, over to you, Edwin.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so thank you, Ian. As Ian mentioned, we were covering revenue today, and I'm going to start with a preliminary timeline of how the staff think we should proceed with the project. And then we're going to talk very high level about the responses we have received and then the CAG feedback at the very end. So in terms of the timeline, what we're proposing, well, we have already done is for the CAG meeting, we have asked for CAG input on 2 big picture issues based on responses that we have received. One is to provide input on the structuring of the 3 EDs. So really whether they're ordered the right way or whether we should think about reordering them when they become final standards. And the second big picture issue is the appropriate level of disclosures that are proposed in the EDs. So for the remaining issues, the staff plans to bring back detailed analyses in March at the next meeting. And mostly they're going to focus on the fundamental issues that have been raised by constituents in the comment letters. I'll get to what those are in a bit. And then in June, we're going to ask for further input from the CAG on things that the IPSASB would have decided on in March. And we're going to have another round of discussion on issues depending on how things go. So in terms of an overview of what we have received to date, we actually did receive over 200 comments if we include late comments that came in after the deadline. As Ian said, we did have a very high response rate for this ED, and I believe it's actually a record for the IPSASB. And because of that, so far the staff has only had time to complete a very high level analysis. And we've come down with 4 overarching themes, which are discussed in detail in the paper. So the 4 of them are the interaction between the EDs, i.e. how they're structured, the extent of disclosures, application and practice, so how the principles are to be applied in practice, and then additional guidance based on additional guidance on the principles. So for the CAG meeting, we have only asked them about the first 2 themes, which is how the EDs are structured and the extent of disclosures. And we did that because we thought at this point in time, the CAG input would help the IPSASB the most on these 2 issues. So in terms of feedback from CAG members, I'll just give a, sorry.
Into that, I just want to pause and just check whether members are clear on the process going forwards and you know, how we're moving into this. Yeah, Lynn.
So I just had a question in terms of the role, if any, of task force on these projects, because from memory, I think we didn't necessarily have a task force in place for each of these EDs. We only had one for ED 70 from memory. Do we think there is a role for a task force, and if so, what, over the next few months?
Thanks, Lynn, that's a good point. Ross, do you want to pick that one up?
Yeah, so just for a reminder for everyone, we did have a task force for ED 71, which was the ED developed based on IFRS 15. We do think there's definitely a role for task forces on these EDs. What we really need to do is we need to sit back as we look at the issues and think about whether that's one overarching task force or multiple task forces and how to break it up. And to be perfectly honest, we just haven't had enough time to formulate exactly yet what that task force should look like, who should be on it. Again, looking at the membership next year and the needs, we kind of need to get into the issues before that. So if the board's okay, I would rather give you a more fulsome update and a proposal on task force structure in March when we have those issues.
Thanks, Lynn. And thanks, Ross. Anything else at this stage, just on process and so on? The only other thing actually I just would add is obviously we've got 3 EDs to examine the feedback on the 2 revenue ones and transfer expenses. The proposal is that in March we focus very strongly on the 2 revenue EDs and get our thinking clear on those, and then we will come back with the benefit of those discussions and have a look at how we approach ED 72, and that will be very much bringing that focus into discussions. Will come back in June. So just to underline that that's the approach. Okay, so Edwin, lead us into the discussion about the guidance, and the other thing I would note is I think as a board, we didn't really pay much attention to the geography of the guidance first time round. I think it's one of those things where, if you like, we led with 70 because we got furthest forward with that, and we built off the thinking on IFRS 15. We already had IPSAS 23, which we updated for ED 71, but we never really had the discussion. So that's why it seems a good time to actually look at the feedback that we've had, look at the options, and to have that discussion. So with those comments, Edwin, over to you.
Yep. Thanks. Okay, so as Ian said, the first issue is on the ordering of the EDs, and a lot of constituents wrote back saying that essentially ED 70 fits into ED 71 because, as you recall from the flow chart, revenue with performance obligation is actually a very specific subset of the overall revenue recognition issues in the public sector. And a lot of constituents noted that they expect ED 71 to apply to more transactions in the public sector. So we gave 3 options to the CAG to consider. The first one was to flip ED 70 and ED 71s and begin with ED 71. And it's not really a simple flip because if you recall, a lot of the concepts and definitions from ED 71 or from ED 70 were carried forward into ED 71. And we did not repeat all of these concepts and definitions, but we rather just referred back to ED 70. So if we do this flip, then there would be some work involved in moving pieces of guidance around to make sure that everything sits in ED 71 first, and then ED 70 would just refer to that. Option 2 is to combine the 2 EDs, and option 3 is to leave the ordering as is. So in terms of CAG feedback, I'll give some high-level comments and let Thomas jump in if he has any more detailed comments. But by and large, most of the CAG members agreed with option 1. And that was mostly because it better reflects the flow of transactions in the public sector. So as I said, most of the revenue transactions are expected to fall within the scope of ED 71, and only a smaller subset would be ED 70. We did have a small handful of CAG members who said that option 2 was better because that would essentially mean that constituents don't have to really think about which standard to look to. But at the same time, other members also said that, well, even though they're a combined standard, we still have to distinguish between performance obligations and transactions without performance obligations. So it doesn't really alleviate the issue entirely. And constituents would still have to make that judgment. And then we had a very small number of CAG members pick option 3, and mostly because in their view, the ordering of the standards doesn't really matter. And if constituents were to apply scoping properly, you would go to the right standard regardless of whether one comes before the other. So at this point, I'll let Thomas jump in if he has any more detailed comments.
Yeah, thanks, Edwin. I think that was already a very good summary. I think I would have started with this remark that when kind of comparing option 1 and option 3, members probably said they don't care because they don't really think that the ordering is so important. But those who kind of thought the ordering would be important, and as Edwin rightly said, in majority supported option 1. I think there was, as Edwin said, some support for option 2 for the 2 reasons which were just mentioned. Kind of avoid flipping between standards. I think one member said the time for stakeholders, it's much higher than staff's time to combine the 2. So I think that was like a little bit like, okay, comparing who has the burden. And I think one member said it would just mirror better that you would have one standard for revenue and one standard for expenses, so that would kind of give like a balance in comparison to have two revenue standards and one expense standard. But there were all, I think, good arguments against option 2 as well, not only supportive for option 2, but also against option 2. The arguments were this change is too heavy and too late at that point in time for constituents to digest. Then another argument was, let me see, to achieve as much IFRS alignment as possible, which is not possible if you would combine the two revenue standards. So kind of leave the IFRS 15 aligned standard as it is. And the third argument was against option 2, looking at the staff's resources to say it is too much resource intensive and should not be done as that. So I think in summary, I heard majority of support for option 1 for those who were of the opinion that the ordering does matter. But thanks, Edwin. I think your summary was already very good.
Thanks. One thing that I would like to point out, I was just reminded that some of the CAG members did say that each standard should be standalone, and we've heard this from constituents too. And they were wondering if it's better to just repeat the definitions and concepts in each of the 3 EDs when they're used, so that constituents won't have to keep flipping back and forth. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Thanks, Edwin.
That's a very good point. Sorry, Ian.
Yeah, and I think that underlines the reason why we're having the discussion at the moment, because it's very much what is, what are our users looking for, what's going to be most useful for them is really, I think, what we should be focusing on at this stage, because there are some short-term considerations in terms of the work involved in moving material around and restructuring if we decide to go that route. But I think we have to look at the fact that these standards are likely to be around for quite a long while, we hope, after the work that's gone in. And therefore, actually, we probably need to look at the finished product and how helpful will that be for users. And, really draw on the feedback that we've had. And we have had a lot of feedback about challenges in communication, people getting stuck in the wrong standard if they start off at 70 rather than being in 71 and so on. So I think, that's what we should be focusing on is what overall is going to work best for our users at the end of the day. So I think with that, I know a number of members were present for the CAG discussions, and really just interested to get initial thoughts, comments, reactions at this stage. Yeah, so I've got Mike, Adrienne, Scott, David, and then we'll just keep carrying on. Just want to get comments from members at this stage. So Mike, lead us off on this one.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. So I did listen to the discussion yesterday, and I think it's been a really good summary from both Edwin and Thomas. I suppose my own view is we should go with option 1. I think option 1 is going to be the easiest one to achieve, but also recognizing what Edwin's just told us, in that if we go option 1, we still want to make sure that they stand alone. So we can at least respond to that request from constituents. The other thing that came up yesterday, which I wasn't sure Thomas covered off on, and that was an observation made by one CAG member, that the expenses ED should be broadened out to cover more disclosure requirements about all types of expenses. I'm not sure that was the purpose of the ED at all, Thomas. I'm not sure if that's something that you picked up on or not, and maybe we just don't need to go there.
I think before we go any further on that one, Mike, no, we won't ask that question, and so no, we don't go out generally. I think, back to the earlier comments about focusing on this is the focus we've got. Okay, thanks for that. So Adrienne, then Scott, then David.
So my comment is rather broad. I don't know if people remember, but from the beginning I've said I'll abstain on these documents, because from my perspective, I don't think they get to the heart of the way the public sector treats revenue. Now, I think one of the big issues was the ordering, that it was coming from a private sector perspective. And so what we think of as the main revenue, tax revenue, you can't even find reference to taxes. And and when I raised this with Ian, and I think I was quite annoying about it, Ian said we're too far along. There's too much water under the bridge. We're not going to fundamentally revisit that. And so I said, okay, I'll abstain. But I just want to tell you that I don't think this standard will be adopted, because I don't think people will see it as something that explains how they should be accounting for revenue in the public sector. So I feel responsible now for raising this again, that it's the issue of the ordering is an important solution, because somewhere it needs to be much clearer what revenue in the public sector is and where it comes from. But it's not just the ordering, it's the drafting, it's the reference to the various concepts of revenue in the public sector, and the issue the public sector has of when to accrue revenue with prudence or certainty or whatever. And none of these issues is addressed. So when I see the responses, although I admit I'm generalizing from responses that don't go that far, I feel the signal is this is dead in the water. If we move on with these three standards, no one will use them. And the question is, why are we working so hard to put out something which won't be adopted in the world? So I unfortunately, my view is not just change the ordering, but stand back and redraft the standards so that we actually take note of what our constituents will need. So I'm sorry to be very fundamental, and I know it's a lot of work, but I think this issue of, well, we've gone so far and how much staff resources do we have is kind of the wrong issue. We shouldn't put out something that's not going to reflect well on us as a standard setter. Thank you.
Adrian, I think we have to accept that you have your views. I think other members would disagree with them, and I would certainly disagree with you in terms of, I don't think these standards are dead in the water. Certainly, having worked very hard on the standard on taxes and transfers, IPSAS 23, it does address taxes. There is a communication issue, certainly, and the ordering is up for grabs at the moment. Terminology is up for grabs. But I think we need to analyse the responses, and I don't think from what I've seen, you will see that there is support for us starting the project again at this stage. So I think we need to limit ourselves to looking at what our respondents have said and working with the three EDs that we've got, rather than throwing the whole thing up at this stage. So I think I understand your views, but I think you have to look at what our constituents have said, and I don't think they agree with you on these are dead in the water. There's a lot of support out there, and we need to work with that. So I'm going to move on round and take Scott, then David, then Ajit.
Thank you, Ian. I thought the CAG conversation was very pointed. It raised an issue for me. Many times they said, let's make it more easy for the user. So if you really went down that route, you would actually pick option 2 because it's all together. But the reason people are overwhelmed with that option is they're thinking about a document. And so I think what this draws to, the reason we're having this discussion is we're visualizing pieces of paper. And if we had a codification, I know that sends chills down everybody's spine when you mention that. But if you had a codification and all this stuff was linked, you wouldn't be having this conversation about why do we have to repeat things in documents. So I think it does put, at some point with the maturity of our standards of getting, I think it raises an issue at this point about whether we need to move towards some type of an item, because a lot of this repetitiveness we're putting in this or referencing is because we don't have really a codification. And so, because I would support option 1 now just because of where we are. But I think it does raise a bigger issue listening to that conversation.
Thanks, Scott. Before I move on, Ross, could you just say something about what's going on in terms of our guidance at the moment and what we can expect to see fairly soon, I think?
Sorry, Ian, I'm not sure.
I'm referring to the IFAC project, so if you can just brief the board on the IFAC project in terms of guidance.
Sorry, yes. So we are working on a digital handbook that will still have a similar structure to our paper-based handbook, but will be much more navigable with links, and it'll evolve over time to become much more dynamic and useful, including being accessible on several types of devices, which I think will move us closer towards what you might call codification, where you have a dynamic table of contents that allows you to go from the standards and the topics directly into the material rather than flipping page by page. That is well underway. IFAC's developing that for the 3 standard setting boards on a common platform. We've been working on it since June, and we're in the process of starting to upload the material and digitalize it into the tool as we speak. So the hope is in the first half of 2021 that we start to have a working prototype that we can start to share with a select user group, and that sometime in 2021 we actually have a full and functioning digital handbook. Yeah.
Thanks, Ross. David, you're no longer in. Okay, I'll go to Ajith, then Lindy, then Lucy.
Thank you, Ian. I was at the meeting yesterday on the CAG meeting, and I found the discussion very interesting. I think one of the reasons why people wanted to look for option 2 was because they had to flip over and look at the document, look at the same material, the information related to the relevant material in the other standard. So I think it would be good to take up the suggestion that we can repeat what is required so that the 2 standards stay standalone. Then the issue of the order will cease to exist. But anyway, we could put option 1 so that the what is more relevant to the public sector comes first. But I think the repetition might be a good alternative. Thank you.
Thanks, Ajith. So go to Lindy, then Lucy, then Todd.
Thank you. So I'm kind of also in the camp where I'm not sure ordering really matters. And I also agree it should stand alone. But I guess if we were to think about it, what would be important is, well, what is the first question you want to ask? And kind of think of what would the decision tree be to help you decide which standard you're in. And I guess then the standards would follow that. So whether it's you first ask if you have a present obligation, or if you ask if you have a performance obligation, then I guess the logical flow would follow that. But I guess we still have to think about that. So for me, that would rather help me drive the ordering, if anything, than just, if it's more pervasive or not in the public sector. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Lindy. So Lucy, then Todd, then Lynn.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I support actually option 1, considering that grants or transfer transactions are prevalent in the public sector. So it is important that we focus first on the generic application of the standard before focusing on the narrower subset of the transactions. So thus, ED 70 should follow after ED 71, as the majority of revenue transactions in the public sector relates to transactions without performance obligations. Also, the first option poses more, I think the first option poses more benefits than shortcomings as compared to the other options. However, I believe that it should also be noted that additional guidance or examples are necessary in distinguishing both EDs, specifically on present obligation and performance obligations. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Lucy. And I think there's no doubt that we are going to have to pay attention to the difference between present obligations and performance obligations. That's very clear from the feedback. Todd, then Lynn, then Mark.
Thank you. I was very pleased with the comment. I think it was a comment that you made, Ian, that what we want to do here is make sure that we are meeting the needs of our users, of our standards. And so I think that is the right focus to take to this. That said, I would probably prefer option 1, but I could live with option 2 as well if that's really going to be in the best interest of our users. So really for me, it does come back to what is in their best interests. And if we can find out and get a good steer on that, I mean, we've got the CAG feedback, which would indicate option 1, but if when we actually look at the detail of the feedback we've got and we get a sense that something else is more appropriate, I think the right thing to focus on is what's best for our users.
Thanks, Todd. So Lynn, then Mark, then Camira.
Thanks, Ian. I guess I had a few observations. I guess for me, I was probably in the option, we shouldn't shy away from the option 2 camp. And the reason why I say that is because if that's what our users are telling us is most beneficial, having all of the revenue standard in one place, then we shouldn't shy away from that. If that is too impossible, then I would be in the option 1 camp. I was always in the option 1 camp at the time we were approving them, for the reason that the vast majority of revenue will be in ED 71, and I always felt that we ought to put that first. I think on ED 70, we ended up with ED 70 because we embarked on an alignment project, but alignment doesn't mean we have to have a standard that matches to a standard. Alignment is within the principles that we adopt within our revenue standard for similar transactions. And so I don't think we should be directing ourselves to have an equivalent standard to that subset of revenue if we don't think that's the right answer for our users. Having said, I'm in the option 2 camp. It's going to be a long standard, and that might cause difficulties. So again, you know, we need to see what our users think, but I think we should also not necessarily debate this now and debate it in March and come to a decision. We need to revisit that decision as we're making other decisions. So picking up on Lindy's point, if actually the first thing that our users will be doing is saying, have I got a performance obligation, then that drives where I am in the standards, or have I, you know, so actually we need to help direct our users through it. But we also need to take account of all their other comments on things like disclosures. So, you know, depending on where we end up on other decisions, like the difference between performance and present obligations and disclosures, actually what might be a really long standard might not necessarily need to be as long and complex depending on other decisions we take. So even if we go with option 1, we probably ought to keep revisiting that as we make other decisions along the way to see if option 2 is viable.
Thanks, Lynn. So go to Mark and then to Camira.
I took note that some constituents based on the high level responded said that they have difficulties in this for distinguishing the performance obligations from the other present obligations, and therefore, or they even said it should produce the same accounting outcome, and therefore it should be combined in a single standard. So given that as of now, the board is still of the view that there is a difference, maybe combining them could prove a little bit more difficult, because at least we have to better explain the difference. I mean, we will have to look at the arguments, whether there is really a difference necessary. As of now, I think so, but if we come to the conclusion that there is a difference, maybe combining them in a standard could prove more difficult. I don't know. But it's also with what Lynn has said, if we come to the conclusion later on that based on very good arguments I have not seen yet, it is difficult to keep this distinction, then maybe we will end up in option 2. But as of now, thinking that we have this distinction, I would rather tend to option 1.
Thanks, Mark. Go to Camira and then back to Lindy.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, first when I saw this agenda topic, I thought that it would not be relevant, the order of the standards, because as of now, we have IPSAS 9 before IPSAS 23, and personally, I haven't heard any complaints about the ordering. But since I really, so reading all the exposure drafts, I noticed that there are a lot of commonalities between both standards and in terms of definitions, in terms of even the illustrative examples. There are so too much repetition between both standards. So I would also think that, okay, maybe one possibility is this option 2 and combining and only presenting one revenue standard, and maybe having like one standard, but just like 2 huge sub chapters that follow more or less the same structure as now. So as in order not to write again a standard from scratch, but only having one standard that just unifies both, and in that way, we do not need to repeat again all the same definitions in one standard and the other. That could help. But now in terms of feasibility and expectations of the constituents, I know that according to our work plan, we expect to issue the revenue standards in September 2021. Now, if we go for option 2, in terms of combining the standards into one, does it mean that we need to re-exposure? Or I would like to know in terms of, that is a question for the staff. So in terms of the 3 options, what are the consequences if we, in the case of, I see that the most, the option 2 is the more disruptive one because we need to combine both. And does it imply that we need to re-exposure the draft and then we will not be able to issue the final pronouncement in September then? So thanks.
Thanks, Camira. Lindy.
Thank you. And I guess maybe a variation of option 2 could be that you put the present and the performance obligation stuff in one standard and the taxes and the rest in the other. But again, I think we need to have a decision at a later stage, but that could be a variation or an option. Thanks.
Thanks, Lindy. So, I mean, just sort of, summarising where we've got to, I think members are clearly supportive of looking at the arrangement of the material. I hear a slight majority in favour of option 1, just reversing 71 and 70. Clearly we do need to examine the options in favour of one standard or against one standard. I think Lynn's point is right on this. I think we need to look at the feedback that we've had on this, because I think we do need to focus on the fact that we've actually had a lot of very good support for the technical solutions we're proposing. So we need to be very careful in deciding how we move forward, not to throw, use the proverb of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. There clearly are issues we have to address in terms of how people will use these standards and what makes sense in terms of the ordering. But I think some of what Camira was referring to also needs to come into our considerations going forwards, because from an expectation point of view, this project has been going on almost 6 years already. And it's quite easy to forget that, because I think probably the only 3 board members around the table that remember the start of this project when they were actually board members are myself, Rod and Michelle. I think it was at the board meeting in Chile, and Todd at that stage was on the staff side from the New Zealand External Reporting Board. So I think, we certainly need to pay, we need to start with what will the end product look like, but I think there probably are some constraints that need to go around this as well in terms of deliverability, bearing in mind that we have got strong support for the technical solutions. So, there's a number of factors we're going to need to weigh here. Now, in terms of the way forward, I think probably what we need to do is actually ask staff to have a more detailed evaluation of what I think really I'm hearing options 1 and 2 would mean in practice, what's involved in delivering those and what those would look like. As Lindy said, there may be some questions about where should the material reside. The problem is always when you put a dividing line in, there's always a problem because people say, well, which side do I fall? So we need to think about that. But I think that's probably the point that we start from is actually we need a more detailed evaluation of options 1 and 2 for us to choose from. I think Lynn's point, though, must come back in. We need to have a look at the detail of what people have said and keep that in mind. But we will need to make a decision before too long because you can't keep everything up in the air. So it may be we can come to that decision, at least a preliminary decision in March, or it may be June, but we can't really leave it much longer than that. Camira's point on the time frame is certainly valid, and Ross has already said we will have a look at that coming out of the March meeting, again, when we have a more detailed understanding of the challenges that we face. But I do think we need to think there are expectations out there that we will deliver this project. So I do think we've got to balance that deliverability with, the temptation just to throw everything up in the air again. I think the other point probably that we need to also think about is in option 2 is that transfer expenses is not a simple mirror of the other issues we're dealing with revenue. The revenue standards between them go much broader. Tax is not considered in transfer expenses, and also pure exchange transactions are not considered in ED72. So I think we do need to think about that. It's not a straight mirror. So that's the final thought. From a staff point of view, does that give you clarity on what the board will be looking for in March? Ross?
Yeah, I'm just want to come in on a point first and then maybe ask Edwin and Eileen if there's anything they want to clarify. But one thing I think is important to clarify in looking at option 1 or 2, I think relates to the core problem with the current EDs. And there might be multiple ways to deal with this, but ED71 is built as a derivative to ED70 at the moment, where you have to read parts of ED70 to understand parts of ED71. And constituents, the theme in the comments, I think, is constituents are saying they're getting caught up in ED70 when they're trying to think about their public sector transactions. So I do think either option 1 or option 2 provide solutions to that. So there might not be a lot of difference in terms of addressing that issue, but we'll have to balance below that what works best in the usability of the standards. But both of those aspects will need to be explored if the board's going to land in the right place. But there is a problem with the EDs as they are phrased right now. And we had these discussions with the UN over the summer, and we had a lot of discussions about transactions they thought were in ED70 because that's where they started their analysis. But when you got to the heart of the issues they were talking about, they're clearly ED71 transactions, but they really struggled to get to that guidance because first they felt they had to assess whether they had performance obligations. That's the issue we need to address. So to Ian's point, I don't think there's fundamental issues with what's been proposed. It's how people are getting to that guidance. There are clarifications needed. There are things and issues we'll need to address. but it really is about setting the model and following it through from start to finish in a way public sector thinks about things. So that's very much what we want to address, but there's two elements to that. There's the problem with the current EDs, and then which of the two solutions will actually provide the best solution to that for the users of the standard. So I really wanted to make that point after hearing what members said today, as well as what I heard at the CAG and what I've seen from going through the responses myself. I don't know, Edwin or Eileen, if there's any specific points you want to clarify related to what you'll bring back on this in March.
Nothing to add to what you've just said, really. And for March, we will look at, like, as you've said, the issues of how usable the standards are and clarifying the distinction between performance obligations and present obligations.
Okay, so Thomas, you want to come in with a final word, and then I want to move us on to the disclosure discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Just to kind of re-emphasize what Ross just said regarding the application guidance, I think that was an overarching theme, which was kind of discussed at the CAG as well, that it is very important for users out there to understand which standard to be used, and that this application guidance should be in one place, not spread over 3 EDs. It should be easy, accessible, and understandable, because this is the entry point, which you have to get right in order to use the right standard. So kind of can only applaud to what Ross just said regarding the importance of that. Thanks.
Thanks. Okay, so I think that was good that we had that discussion at that point in time, because it does set the scene, but I think that's been very helpful, having that in both the board and the CAG at the same time, and getting that breadth of input on how on the options moving forward. So if we can then move on then to the other issue, which again was an unresolved issue from the ED development process, where really we got to this issue very late in the day, and we were still discussing this in the December meeting, and in the end we went with leveling up the disclosures on the IFRS 15 model, because that enabled us to take out at a later stage. Clearly there is plenty of criticism of the extent there. So Edwin, lead us into that, and then we'll pick up on the CAG discussion on this.
Yeah, so for the second issue that we discussed at the CAG, I'm not going to throw out the slide again because it was just 2 boxes. But so the underlying issue is, as Ian said, we use IFRS 15 disclosures for essentially all 3 EDs. So ED 71 used the same revenue disclosures as ED 70, and then ED 72 essentially flipped the disclosures for revenue and use those for expenses. So the main concern we had was from constituents was that they pointed out that in the private sector, revenue is a key risk area. Essentially, every single company is expected to go into detail about their revenue activities, and even when when an audit is being performed, revenue is almost always a fraud risk. In the public sector, the same risk isn't really there, or at least not to the same degree. So most of the constituents questioned, well, why are we having all these IFRS 15 disclosures for transactions that don't necessarily have the same level of risk? And some constituents also said, well, if you look at the flip side, a lot of expenses also don't have the same level of risk. So they thought, well, isn't this really too much disclosures? And the other issue they've raised for expense disclosures was that a lot of the requirements we've added in assumes that the transfer provider has full information on the satisfaction of performance obligations by the transfer recipient. And in practice, that almost is very rare for that to happen. So they've again said, well, in practice, we don't think we can provide a lot of this information. So what we've proposed to the CAG, rather than having options, we said, well, what if we take a more principles-based approach? And we'll start off with ED70 transactions and said, well, those transactions are very similar to the private sector revenue transactions. So perhaps there is support to just carry over the IFRS 15 disclosures for ED70 transactions. For the next step, we said, well, for ED71, we do agree that the level of risk and the level of scrutiny might not be the same as in the private sector. So perhaps it would be better to start with the IPSASB 23 disclosures and layer on additional disclosures as we see fit based on differences between IPSASB 23 and ED71. And then for expenses, we said, well, perhaps it would be better to focus on the underlying risk of expenses. So things like, providing information on material expenses, and where there was a lot of judgment involved in recognizing an asset upon first transferring the resources. Perhaps constituents can talk about that in more detail. And lastly, going back to revenue, there might be cases where revenue is recognized in an arrangement that does not have a binding arrangement. Well, in that case, the key risk is whether if the arrangement is really non-binding. And the other key risk is whether the resources can be recognized as an asset. So we propose for non-binding revenue arrangements to have just those two disclosure requirements. So in terms of feedback from the CAG, we had a very interesting comment right off the bat, and it was that for expenses, the level of scrutiny is actually higher for the public sector. So they thought perhaps we should leave all the disclosures in, but that would essentially conflict with the practicability issue of whether transfer providers can get all the information. So perhaps we were thinking maybe we can still leave the same level of disclosures, but really pinpoint, in some cases where you just cannot get the information, that would actually be key information that users would be interested in. So rather than, just saying, oh, you are required to provide all this information that you might not be able to get, it might be better for constituents just to say, well, we couldn't get all this information because of all these reasons. And in general, on the revenue side, there was a lot of support for what we've proposed. So keeping ED70 disclosures as is, because it's closely aligned to the private sector, and having a lower level of disclosures based on IPSASB 23 for ED71 type transactions. So Thomas, I don't know if you had other points you would like to add at this point.
Yeah, thanks, Edwin, again for the good and comprehensive summary. I hope, Mike, that Edwin addressed the point you were missing in the first part of the CAG's presentation or results. I think it was covered here in this context. Actually, it was really like that the member shared a lot of sympathy for making the requirements less onerous, but this member was kind of lacking or missing a disclosure strategy and thought it would not be consistent and comprehensive or convincing enough, exactly for the reasons which Edwin just outlined. I think in general, kind of all members supported a more principle-based approach to deciding on what level of disclosures would be needed. And as Edwin rightly said, I think starting from IFRS 15 requirements for commercial transactions was supported, and then kind of lowering the bar step by step, as Edwin has proposed and just outlined, was supported, because it was thought that it's not suitable to have all the IFRS 15 requirements for all revenue transactions. I think just one last comment I would like to make is that we had a discussion on, is it really so onerous to have all these requirements? Because there's the aspect of materiality, and if kind of an information is not material, it could be left out, even if the standard would require this this information. But I think CAG members agreed that, especially in the public sector entities tend to kind of overfulfill these requirements, because it's much easier to kind of provide the information compared to convincing your auditor that this information would not be material. So it doesn't matter what the standard setter writes in the standard, and therefore I think the board should really look at not kind of asking for too much with kind of just pointing to materiality and say, okay, if it's not material, they can leave it out. It's not as easy as that. Thank you.
Thanks, Thomas. So open up for comments from members. Lindy.
Thank you, and I agree. I guess that maybe it goes without saying. If we start with the IFRS 15 disclosures, we would still have to consider if they're relevant and appropriate for the public sector, and if there are additional public sector disclosures we would want to add. So we would still have to look at it through a public sector lens and then move to the next level. So I just don't want us to say, well, it's in IFRS 15, it must stay. Because I think some comments were concerned, well, some respondents were concerned about those.
Thanks, Lindy. Rod?
Thanks, Chair. The whole argument around a risk is a pretty interesting one, and views that there may be less risk in the public sector are, I find, kind of interesting. I do align myself more with the CAG perspective around risk, and I say that for the following. If you're a fiscal manager managing in the public sector, the risk around your financial position can have significant economic impact. It can have a political impact. It can have impact on how the public is perceiving your government. It can have a broad range of impacts for jurisdictions that have balanced budget legislation. It can have huge consequences. So to say that the risks aren't there, I would in fact argue that the risks in the public sector are substantially more significant and have a much higher impact in the sense that economic instability that is a result of a financial position. If you look at the various meltdowns that have happened in certain countries around the world when they've run into financial problems, you know, it's been huge and there's been global impact. So I would say the risks are very significant. And if anything, I think that supports a really good and thoughtful look at the information that's being provided. So if anything, if you want to look at economic stability as a linkage to social stability and quality of life, I think the implications are huge. So I've always viewed us as being not in the standards business, but in the economic stability business. And if you're in the economic stability business, you're in the quality of life business.
Thanks, Rod. Mike? Yeah,
thanks, Chair. And I just wanted to support Rod. I think, although Rod, I don't know how you build that into a standard. That's the trouble. I mean, over this COVID period, in jurisdictions that are trying to estimate their revenues that they may collect or may not collect, or what those revenues are in the first place, is proving very difficult. So I think you're right. The risk is high. I'm not sure how you then build into the standards what you want preparers to do. But I think your point's valid, and we need to think about it.
Thanks, Mike. I mean, I think what's come out of this is the nature of risks may well be different, and there may also be a question as to framing this in terms of which are the risks which this is relevant to, you know, and which are the bigger picture risks. So we're going to have to think about that. David.
Thank you. I mean, I think that those comments, particularly Rod's and Mike's support, were very interesting, and I would agree with them. So I think perhaps when we're looking at disclosures, it's not so much looking at, say, IFRS 15, and I would disagree with Thomas's use of the term lowering the bar, because I don't think we should be doing that. I think it's actually looking at the type of revenues, the type of expenses that we're getting, and actually encouraging preparers to think about the risks associated with those in their own circumstances and making the required disclosures. So, you know, if you take on the sort of leading on from Rod's point about, you know, the fiscal risks, then actually you're looking at taxes. That's you know, how convinced are you that you're collecting what you should be collecting? What are you doing about collecting stuff that you know is in a black market or something like that? So you need to think more carefully. It's not just sort of, oh, IFRS 15 says we've got to disclose X, Y, and Z. It might be totally irrelevant, but other disclosures will be very, very important.
Thanks, David. Todd, and then back to Rod.
You know, thanks everyone for your comments. I've listened with interest and agree with the things that have been said. Just reflecting, you know, because we were talking at the beginning of the session about this being quite a big picture discussion, and I was just sort of reflecting and thinking, you know, when it comes to disclosure, it's all about meeting the needs of the readers of the financial statements to hold an entity to account and for decision making. And I think so long as we keep in mind sort of the principle around that, when it comes to disclosures, we'll be making the right sort of decisions. So we really do need to bring it back to that bigger picture. And I did like, Edwin, you sort of saying that the discussion with the CAG was taking that step back and thinking about some of the principles. And I just wonder whether we need to sort of factor in that broader principle that's sort of at the heart of what we're here to do.
Thanks, Rod, back to you.
Thanks, Chair. Just a general observation. So this is not a comment about the work that's being done. I'm completely satisfied with the work that's being done, and I think the staff are going through the right process. So this is not intended to be a diversion in terms of staff work. My observation is that I think as colleagues know, there's a lot of work going on right now around sustainability. The IFRS Foundation is looking at the possibility of creating a sustainability board. We have the sustainability board in the US that has been around for a few years now. And Bob Hertz, who was the former chair of FASB, is on that board. There's been a lot of work that's been ongoing. So given that that whole area is looking at environmental issues, social responsibility, governance, the whole ESG area, it's just something on an ongoing basis that the board can at least be aware of. So when these conversations happen and people are wondering, are we taking a broad kind of perspective? I think it's important to know that there are groups that are thinking of this, will look at developing standards. So I just think as a complementary intellectual exercise, knowing what's happening going forward will help the board, because the board won't feel it's got to do all of these things that it may not be designed to do. There are others that are doing it. It's just important to know where that interface is and that how things are proceeding in some of those other areas. So I say that more as a comfort thing in terms of being comfortable with the scope that we do have.
Thanks, Rod. I think that very much takes us into the discussion that we'll have around the work programme, because those considerations are clearly relevant there. I think it's also, it kind of chimes in with the discussion that we had around natural resources, which is where does this sit in relation to those other bigger picture things, and reminding ourselves about that would be really good, but not that we have to solve everything here if it's being looked at there. So I think that's helpful. I'm not seeing any other hands raised at the moment. It does seem to me, therefore, that board members are sympathetic to that general approach that we should take a look at it from a risk-based perspective, because I think the challenge we have as a board is we need a principled way to look at this. People will always want less disclosure. Certainly preparers will always want to provide less disclosure. The question is, and so it's inevitable we got that response. The question is, how do we as a board work out what the principles are that we're applying in developing those disclosures going forwards? It does seem that I think there probably is back to the communication issue. Actually, we probably need to develop a clearer view as to what if you like, proportionately the bigger sources of revenue actually are, and therefore which are being addressed through which standard. And you know, clearly, and this probably picks up Adrian's earlier point, if people can't see where taxes is being dealt with, then we've probably, you know, we're not hitting the mark equally, transfers and so on. And so there may be something even as simple as actually just the titles that we eventually give the standards. You know, we had a subtitle for IPSAS 23, which was taxes and transfers, even although the overall title was non-exchange revenue. So there may be some things like that. But I think probably one of the asks for staff is that, you know, we can't, no country is absolutely typical, but I think you can be clear that with most governments, the majority of their revenue will come from taxation. For a lot of individual entities elsewhere in the public sector, transfers in the form of appropriations, grants, and so on will be important. And then there will be some that have commercial income. But if you look at revenue overall, you know, I think we need that context for our debates going forward. And then that, you know, understanding of the different types of revenue and the risks associated with that should then drive our discussion when we get into the disclosures. But I think it's probably important that we at least get more of a shared view when we start our discussion in March, actually. So I think that's something that probably, you know, at least, you know, to an order of magnitude, we can kind of get that shared overview, which will then help us in terms of, therefore, what's the overall, you know, priority, Lindy's point about where are people likely to get into this and so on. So maybe that's actually something that we need from staff as a very generic high-level view as you know, the relative importance of the revenue sources. I think that's probably about all the comments that board members have at this stage. Edwin, probably back to you. Hopefully that's given you a good steer.
Yes, it does. So I just have one more slide left on next steps. So quickly go through that. So in terms of next steps, right now we haven't really solicited comments from staff or from members in detail, but if any members do have any comments based on what constituents have written in about, then please let us know. As I said, for the March 2021 meeting, we plan to update the overview analysis for the 6 late responses that we've received. We're also going to propose a detailed project timeline for the IPSASB's approval in March, and part of that will involve proposing a task force team if required. And lastly, we're also going to provide detailed analysis on selected key issues in the March meeting. Okay, so
right.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Edwin. I think that has been a really good sort of scene setter, if you like, for the discussions we're going to have in March. I think one comment I was going to make up front is I think we should thank staff for how much analysis they've managed to do already on this, you know, given the very short time. I think they've done a fantastic job in giving us the overview that we've been able to, we and the CAG have been able to use. So really well done. And that, I think, gives me a lot of optimism in terms of the raw material we'll have for March. Mike and then Ross.
Thanks, Chair. So I just wanted to clarify with Edwin that last point, give us more analysis on the key themes or whatever those words were, Edwin. I want to make sure that we know what those are so we don't get to March and then the board member says, oh, well, we hadn't thought about X. And your agenda item 8.2.1 seems to summarize what you think the key issues are, other than the 2 we've already discussed. So am I right in saying those are currently the ones that you're going to explore further?
Yes, we'll be focusing on the key themes.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Ross, over to you.
Yeah, just On that point though, Mike, we do have to highlight that there is a detailed review of responses going into the details that still needs to happen, guided by those themes. So again, to Ian's point, we didn't start analyzing the responses till the end of the consultation period, which was November 1st. And we had some late stragglers right up until our absolute cutoff, where we couldn't take those final 6. So there are, we do need to dig back in. I just wanted to echo Ian's comments to staff and just state that we wouldn't have been able to do this analysis in this way if we were doing under our old process where we did the cut and paste of the comments. It's really using the in vivo tool and the functionality it gives us that's allowed us to move this quickly. So I just wanted to highlight that that's an innovation that we've been using for a few years now, but it really is helping us get through the comment letters and minimize the amount of administrative cut and paste and working with the comments and actually dig into the analysis. So I think it's important to note that. And there's still more analysis to come by using that tool for March.
Yeah, I think there's a lot more. So you needn't worry, there won't be plenty of material to get your teeth into in March. But I think we've had some good high-level discussions, which I was keen that we had at this stage before we actually dive down into the detail, because as a board on the whole, we love debating the detailed points, and I wanted to bring it right up to get that perspective before we move forward. So I think with that, we draw this morning's session to a close. I think we've had good discussions this morning. We will move tomorrow then into consideration of the material that staff has circulated already in response to the issues we identified on measurement and the update of the conceptual framework chapter on measurement. We obviously have now completed the consideration of revenue that we were going to do tomorrow. So that allows us to spend the whole of the session tomorrow on ED76 and ED77 issues, and that's really to make sure that we are in a good place for approval on Tuesday and Wednesday. So I think there probably is one issue that you haven't yet had papers on. I'm not sure whether staff will be able to circulate anything in advance or not, because I think there is a meeting going on with the valuers later on today. But I think we've, even leaving that aside, we've still got plenty of very good material to review and digest. I know I've got plenty to do this afternoon. So thanks to staff for that. Thanks everyone for a good session today, and look forward to seeing you again tomorrow.
Bye everybody.